Hello and welcome to the Particular Baptist Podcast. My name is Daniel Vincent, here back with my trusty co-host Sean Cheatham. He's back for this evening. And then special guest Andrew Work, who's going to be carrying our discussion today. We're going to be talking about analogy in God. How do we speak of God rightly, given that God is completely simple, that God is completely distinct and separate from his creation? So we're going to go through some models, if you will, and some discussions on how to properly speak of God, really looking at good and necessary consequence from what we know about God's being and seeing how we can properly speak of God. To kind of start us off in this, I want to read a section from The Failure of Natural Theology by Jeff Johnson. For those of you who may not know, we did an episode responding to this book. Go and check it out, where we go through in great detail rebutting the book. But there's a section that's applicable to what we're going to be talking about today. You can find it on page 182 in the printed edition. It says, in the same way, for language of God to be truly analogical, some words must have the same meaning for God as they do for us, such as the word love. Of course, we don't have an exhaustive understanding of the word love, nor do we even come close to knowing love as God knows love. But if the word love for God and the word love for us does not at least have a small point of identity, we can no longer speak of language as being analogical. If there is no point of similarity, then the statement God is love means nothing at all. So that's really the crux of our discussion tonight, is analogy. When we ascribe things to God, are we speaking of him univocally, meaning in a one-to-one fashion, or are we speaking to him analogically in a way that is indirect, in a way that is still speaking of him meaningfully and truly, but at the same time in a way that is creaturely, that doesn't ascribe creatureliness to the divine essence? So that's what we're going to be discussing this evening. And with that, Andrew, I'll turn it over to you to get us started.
All right, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that intro. So, yeah, our motivation here, at least one of them, is there is a lot of talk about the different kinds of what we call predication. Many followers of the doctrine of God debate have probably heard that we speak of God analogically, not equivocally or univocally, but it's pretty rare to get into more detail about what we really mean by analogy and how it avoids the issues that equivocal or univocal predication ways of speaking would get you into. And we just saw with Jeff Johnson, even with a man like that who runs a seminary, there's confusion about what the term means in its historical usage, because he basically treats it as something with a univocal core. In other words, there's a core similarity in the things themselves, and that's what he understands by analogy. But that's not how it's been historically used, and we're confident that a lot of other people were probably confused about what exactly this means. So that's what we're going to be getting into today, and we got a PowerPoint to keep things a little bit more visually interesting for those who are watching and to help keep us on track too. So the problem that we're trying to address when we're using analogical speech, what we're really trying to address is the apparent conflict between two biblical truths, which is that God is completely other than his creature. He's completely different. There's an absolute creator-creature distinction. And the other biblical truth, which is that when the Bible speaks about God, it's using meaningful language. It's not just talking in the wind. We're actually having God revealed to us in some way. So the issue is, how can both of those things be true? How can God be so totally dissimilar to us? And also for us to be able to use our language, talk about him, and to actually say something meaningful. And that's kind of the dilemma that addresses us here. So the first danger is if we adopted what's called univocal language. We've already used the term so far. It just means speaking about things the same way as we do here. Like if we say that God is good in the exact same way that we are, or he's holy in the same way a saint might be holy. If when the Bible talks about him having arms and wings, if he has those in the same way that creatures do. So you can see the problem with this. It's making God creaturely when we do this. It collapses the difference between the creator and the creature. And this is especially a problem in light of the biblical truth of divine simplicity, namely that God is without parts. All that is in God is God. So if any part of God, even the smallest part of him, was in any way creaturely, then the entirety of God would be creaturely, because he doesn't have parts where only one part could be affected and not the whole of God. And likewise, if anything in the creature had something in common with the divine nature, it would have the entirety of the divine nature, because to have a part of God, so to speak, would be to have all of God. So clearly this is a problem. This leads to complete pantheism, and the difference between creator and creature collapses altogether. We make him entirely like us. The other danger is the danger of meaninglessness. So if it was completely different, like, what does it matter that we say something like God is good, for example? What does that mean? What does that assert about God any more than if you said God was evil? We know instinctively that's a bad thing to say, because we know he's not evil. We know he's good. But what do we mean by that if our terms are completely meaningless? If we use equivocal language, if we use language where there's no similarities between God as a subject or a creature as a subject. In such a view, as Thomas Aquinas says, a reason cannot be assigned why some names more than others are applied to God. So therefore, we need a third way of speaking. We can't speak either equivocally or univocally. We need a third way, which we call analogy. So to get into the history of the term, Thomas Aquinas was really the one who popularized it. He's not the first one to use the term, but he definitely popularized it and kind of spearheaded a lot of the discussion that we have today. Although he himself didn't define what he meant that clearly, he kind of goes between two different models in his writings, depending on what point of his life he was in. But even though the term is new, the general concept wasn't new. So the term as used by Aquinas and his followers overlaps with Boethius's category called equivocation by design. So he had something called equivocation by chance. An example of that would be if we call a bat a bat, or a baseball bat a bat, like a bat the animal or the baseball equipment. That's equivocation by chance. So you have two words with the same name, but for completely different reasons. There's no reason why they're named the same. It just kind of happened that way. The other category is equivocation by design, where there's actually a reason why they're given the same name. And this is these are the subcategories that would be used by Aquinas and his followers and described as analogy. Interestingly enough, one of these subcategories of equivocation by design, Boethius called proportio, and he was actually just giving the name, translating the name for the category Aristotle presented, which he called analogia. So one of the subcategories of analogy is actually called analogy. So that can be a little bit confusing. So we're going to call it proportio or proportion.
Andrew's throwing Aristotle around. Look out.
Yeah, we're being bad Catholics. In fact,
Catholics are great philosophers.
Yeah, in fact, I actually forgot to mention, and this is really going to get me in trouble. Probably the most helpful resources I had when studying this issue, and if you want to go deeper, I'd recommend it, is a book called Analogy After Aquinas, and this is by Dominique de Tour, if I'm saying his name right. And this was published by Catholic University Press. So we're being very bad Baptists today. But the reality is, for those who actually have any concern with that, this is what we would call part of the lower C Catholic tradition, in the sense that we're addressing a biblical problem that is something that all denominations have to address. Now, of course, the Catholic Church has ignored some biblical problems altogether and substituted tradition instead of the Bible. But there are a few areas like this in the Trinity where they've maintained biblical truth in that area, and so they have a long history of dealing with this issue. So if they're dealing with the same issue and they've spent a lot of time with it, it's worth consulting to see what they have, if it's any good. And in this case, I think it is. I think this will be helpful for people.
And truth
Quick
is
question. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Sean.
truth is truth, no matter who says it. So
Right.
we might have outright heretics, flagrant heretics, and if they have a kernel of truth in there, we have to take it seriously, and we can potentially learn from that. Not that we shouldn't necessarily be on our guard, that we wouldn't imbibe certain things that aren't true, but if somebody says something's true, it's perfectly acceptable to follow their logic, assuming it is correct.
Yeah, otherwise you fall into the genetic fallacy of just, oh, that person said it, and because they believe this or said this or whatever, I'm just going to throw out everything. Yeah, we definitely don't want to fall into that category. So Andrew, when you're talking about the history of analogy, are you saying that Boethius was really the one who developed this concept as it relates to God in the church? I mean, it was probably seen before, but is he the one who kind of formalized it?
So Boethius, when he was defining the categories, I don't even know if he was necessarily defining them to apply to God. He was more commenting on Aristotle's works, because Boethius was a big translator of Aristotle and helped to formalize a lot of those ideas for the rest of the Middle Ages. So what he did, he was very influential for the discussion going forth. I don't know if he actually applied it to God himself. But even so, there's always been a universal recognition that when we talk about God, he is completely different than us, and our terms don't capture what we're saying. Like, take Augustine, for example, when he was talking about the use of the term persons. He says, I'm not using person because it sufficiently describes the persons of the Trinity, but just because I don't want to be reduced to silence. I got to say something. So there's always been that universal recognition of the ineptitude of language. What Aquinas really did was help to formalize a solution, or to at least begin to formalize like a more scientific, if we want to put it that way, solution to the issue. But it's always been something the church has kind of instinctively understood.
Got it. Makes sense.
All right, absolutely. So let's move on. So now we're going to get to the problem of having a category of analogy. So we saw the problem that analogy is trying to grapple with, but now there's a problem of whether analogy can even do the job. And this is what John Duns Scotus brings up. He lived around the same time of Aquinas. I think their lives overlapped slightly, but he's basically the generation after. But he denied the legitimacy of analogical speech altogether. He argued for a form of univocal predication, at least from the standpoint of a logician. There actually is some debate, I'll say as a side note, of whether he believed that we use the terms univocally when speaking about God from a metaphysical standpoint. But that's a complicated issue. It all depends whether in this one passage of his work he's qualifying himself or actually representing another position that he doesn't hold. So we won't get into that. But in any case, his objection kind of sparked the Thomist after him to try to defend the concept of analogy. So his argument is that there is no third way of speaking, because either the terms have nothing really in common, in which case they're equivocal, or else there is a similarity which implies a univocal core. Like, why is it a good analogy? It's because they have something in common. It's got to have a univocal core, is what he's arguing. And so the language would be just partly equivocal and partly univocal, rather than some kind of third way of speaking, which means it doesn't actually address the problem of either avoiding meaningless language or avoiding the creator-creature collapse. So that's a big issue. And again, I just want to note again that this language of univocal core, that's essentially what Johnson thinks analogy is in his work. But that's actually the very charge that the later Thomists are trying to defend analogy from, is that there's a univocal core.
It's interesting that you say that it doesn't really solve the problem either way. It's trying to combine both of those issues. It's trying to be equivocal and univocal at the same time, I think, while not being. It's trying to say that you can combine them together while neglecting a third option.
Yeah,
Not solving
exactly.
any of those issues that are presented by equivocation or univocal language.
Yeah, because ultimately, if there's anything univocal in your analogy, like a univocal core of like where the two analogates, so to speak, have in themselves like a real commonality, then yeah, you have the issue we discussed at the beginning, which is destroying the creator-creature distinction, making
Yep.
God entirely creaturely or the creature entirely divine. So you get pantheism. So it's just not good enough. Another thing that kind of confused the matter further was that, as we saw, analogical speech was originally just a subtype of equivocal speech, and so that was kind of an issue because even Aquinas himself acknowledged that equivocal speech is always susceptible to what's called the fallacy of equivocation, which means because you're using the same name but for really different concepts. You can't really make a logical demonstration from that. You can't use a syllogism. Otherwise, you'll say something like, bats are an animal, a baseball bat's a bat, therefore a baseball bat's an animal. Obviously, it doesn't follow. That's the fallacy of equivocation. But what's being called analogy actually fell under originally what was called an equivocation by design. So that creates an issue. Really, that's an issue of semantics, but it kind of helped to heighten the issue in the minds of people trying to defend analogy. Okay, but people did come up with solutions, and I believe they're good solutions. So later medieval Thomists had various ways of solving the issue, but in order to be a viable solution, it has to do three things. One has to explain what exactly is meant by an analogical language. I have to explain how it is meaningfully different from equivocal and univocal language, and it has to explain how it avoids the fallacy of equivocation without making God-like creatures. So there are two main subcategories of analogy that are used for this purpose. They're both were used at one point by Aquinas in his life or another, and various followers would embrace one, the other, or some mixture of the two. Okay, so the first model is called the healthy model. So to back up a little bit, there are four of these categories. One is similitude, proportion, ab uno, and ad unum. And one of the first popular ways of dealing with the analogy problem was an appeal to the ad unum type, which is what we're calling the healthy model. It's also what Dominique de Tor and probably many others have called the healthy model. So we don't have to keep saying ad unum, ad unum. Healthy model is easier to grasp. So it appeals to names based on a priority and posteriority of relationship when you're predicating the names of them, often by virtue of the one thing producing an effect in the other. And the example we'll keep going back to is the healthy model, where medicine is called healthy because it makes someone healthy. So again, healthiness is said primarily of the thing made healthy, but medicine is also called healthy because it produces that effect. So it's kind of a cause and effect relationship, and that's what gives rise to the analogical predication, where you can say healthy of medicine. The other type of model, rather, that we're going to be dealing with is Boethius's proportio, which is also called the principal model. This model refers to names based on similarity of principles or function. An example of this that's often given is that a point and a line are the first principles of different genre. So the point is the fundamental zeroth dimensional object, and the line is the fundamental first dimensional object. And another good example, which I think is going to be even more helpful, is that a mind is said to see, like an eye is said to see. You have a similarity of function between the mind and the eye, and so they're both said to see. That's the principal model of analogy. So how does this relate to God? And again, different men would champion one or the other or a mixture. But in my opinion, both are actually quite useful in understanding the full range of the way that the Bible speaks about God. So we're going to start with exploring the healthy model, particularly the healthy model and the universals or the perfections. So when we understand that we do sometimes name things by virtue of the effect they produce, it helps us to understand how God is traditionally and scripturally identified with universals. The classic example is 1 John 4:8, God is love, or Christ's words in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. The Bible doesn't merely say that God is loving or God is true. It says God is the truth. God is love. And following this, the Christian tradition has been comfortable with calling God goodness himself, mercy himself, wisdom himself. He in Proverbs, I would argue, is calling God wisdom himself too, when it's prefiguring Christ in his descriptions of wisdom. So just like medicine is called healthy because it makes one healthy, if we're comfortable with calling things by virtue of the effect they produce, we should realize right away that God not only makes one healthy, he makes healthiness itself. He makes goodness itself. He makes mercy itself, truth itself. So he's rightly, and I'd say he's rightly identified with these positive universals, these perfections, as opposed to other things he creates, like evil, because they have they have pure manifestations of isness where isness ought to be. As a side note, the episode that Dolezal was on recently, I think would be very helpful background for this section here. God is not the author of evil because evil has non-being. It's the absence of perfections. It's the absence of good where good ought to be. And the same thing is true of creation in general, even things that we wouldn't strictly call evil. Everything is essentially a combination and participation to a certain limit of the perfections. Because evil and lack isn't being itself. It's not a substance that God creates. God rather creates things that share in perfections equally or unequally. But the thing he directly creates, the things with isness, are the perfections. So that's why it's proper to say that it's more proper to say that God is goodness than it would be to say like God is chair or something like that, because the perfection is what he's actually directly creating there. So it makes sense that we would speak of him that way. So he's more suitably identified with those than anything in creation. And the Bible supports that concept of God not being the author of the imperfections, like we see in James 1:13. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he himself tempt anyone. Obviously, God creates conditions in which people are tempted. He creates imperfect creatures that are capable of being tempted, but the substance of temptation or evil itself isn't a thing that's created. He just creates things with limited goodness, limited perfections.
You know, it's interesting. This kind of, I think that view is very consistent with the idea that God's attributes are not actually distinct in him. It's just who he is. It's God is not, there's not like a part of God that's pushing forth goodness and then we see it in his effects. We see the goodness in the effects that he creates, and then we're just saying that it's who God is. It's the one attribute of God. It's not something particular of his essence that we can point out and really wrap our minds around. So I think that model kind of helps to explain and to be consistent with the idea that God, being simple, is not composed of multiple attributes, but his attributes are essentially the same.
Yeah, absolutely. The perfections are only distinct in creation, but in himself,
Right.
they're all one, and he manifests those attributes with the one same divine act.
Yep.
So to continue a little bit further, just to kind of strengthen the association with God and his perfections, by the perfections being a type of isness, so to speak, a type of being without privation, without lack in them, where something ought to be. The universals have a participation in God, so to speak, to a degree that is unique to them. Now, some people might kind of step back when they hear the term participation. We don't mean participation in a pantheistic sense. We don't mean participation in the sense that, oh, they form part of God or the like. Not as we know them in the creaturely realm, for sure. They do not. Rather, when we talk about participation, we talk about it how Christians in the past often would speak of it, which is more like the participation of a leaf in the wind. So it's the leaf and the wind are entirely distinct. The wind isn't infused into the leaf or the leaf into the wind. The leaf remains the leaf, but nevertheless, it participates in a sense. It's acted upon by it, and the perfections, in a very pure sense, participate in God that way. In fact, all things participate in God in this sense, because Acts 17:28 says, "In him we live and move and have our being." We're participating in his power, which is identical to himself, but yet we ourselves are distinct from him. But because these are the perfections that kind of ground our existence itself, without any privation, they participate in that isness, that power, that act of God in a more unique degree, that nothing else does. So it makes them very suitable subjects for the healthy model of predication, the healthy model of analogy when we speak about God, because there's most pure effects. And to participate more in them is, in a sense, to participate more in God. All right, so that's the healthy model. The next model of analogy is the principle model. So that's all well and good to say that God is goodness himself, mercy himself, but he's more than just the cause of goodness. As Aquinas says in the Summas, he causes goodness in things because he is good. And that's, I think, usually how the Bible speaks of him. They speak of his goodness because of his doing good. He's redeeming his people, showing mercy to thousands, in his displays of justice in the world. And the principle model of analogy allows us to say these sorts of things without destroying the creator-creature distinction, because the things compared are similar by virtue of their activities, rather than the two things being considered simply in themselves. So I'm going to quote from Dominique de Tours when he's summarizing the position of another Dominique of Flanders, who is a 15th century Thomist. And he says, there is not, simply speaking, any particular relationship between the analogates themselves which provides the grounds for the common name. Rather, the agreement between the analogates is found in the at once similar but different characteristics or activities of the analogates themselves. So again, this is the model of both the mind and the eye being said to see. They have similar activities, and yet the mind and the eye are distinct. And to justify this, I want to point out it's a very natural way of speaking. Like when we say that a soul is good and a tree is good, we are not intending to imply any similarity in the essences of the two or provide an explanation of what a soul truly is. We're not saying a tree is like a soul when we're saying a soul is good and a tree is good. We're speaking in terms of principle. A soul is good because it does good. A tree is good because it bears a good fruit. I don't know about you, but I don't really know what a soul is. I don't know how it works. I experience it, but it's a very mysterious thing. But I can still say things about it without comprehending it. And this is why the principle model can be used without destroying the creator-creature distinction, because we're not really saying anything about God that demystifies him, so to speak. You can have utterly dissimilar things in one sense, be similar by virtue of their activities. I think a good example we have today are AIs. So the AIs can speak much like people can speak. You can have a conversation with an AI if they're sophisticated enough. But speech is something that the soul does. The soul is behind speech, ultimately. The soul is the mover of speech, but it's not for an AI. And the AI has 0% soul in it. It is a purely material thing. Yet, nevertheless, they can do similar things. So I think that's a good proof that just because things are performing similar activities doesn't imply that they're sharing similar essences if you consider them as they are in themselves. Likewise, there's analogy between our goodness and God's goodness. And God, in an infinitely higher capacity, can perform good to us like creatures can do good to us, which he does. He does through Christ. He shows goodness that no man is capable of showing to us. He sent his only begotten Son to die in the place of sinners and lavish them with every spiritual blessings in the high places. There's nothing else you can call that but good. And it is something God does, and so we can call God good because of this. And, much more good than anything in creation. Yet in himself, he exercises the goodness in an entirely dissimilar way to us. Much like a mind and an eye see in different ways, he wills good to us in a completely different way than we will good. He, in himself, does his good through the one divine act, which is identical with his subsistence itself. This is completely incomprehensible to us, but we can understand that though it's incomprehensible, he is good because he shows us he is good. He is good analogically. The other good thing about the principle model is that it solves the equivocation problem. That's something that the healthy model can't do very well. There have been some who have made some pretty noble attempts at that, I believe, but it's difficult because, like we showed before, if you try to have a syllogism like for example, all healthy things are alive, medicine is healthy, it just doesn't follow that medicine is alive because you're really naming healthy primarily of the thing experiencing the health and not medicine itself. Medicine is only called healthy in that secondary sense, and that makes syllogisms dangerous. The conclusions don't necessarily follow. But insofar as the principle model identifies real similarities by virtue of common activities, syllogistic reasoning can be justified in those cases if we can identify what the similarities are. For example, we can say that good things do good, God is good, and it most certainly follows that God does good. To conclude everything, both forms of analogy, that is the healthy model and the principle model, can be useful to understand the full range of the way that the Bible speaks about God. The principle model is the usual way of speaking and allows for logical demonstration when talking about God, but the healthy model is also useful in helping us to understand how God is identified with the universal perfections.
Wow, lots of good stuff there. So it almost seems like both models are utilizing the same premise that God is known by his effects. It's just a matter of how that's really applied. One is talking about the universals and one is focusing more on the effects themselves, but I think they both have the same premise.
Yeah, absolutely, because the reality is we can never observe God as he is in himself.
Right.
We have creaturely eyes, creaturely ears that can only pick up creaturely things. So for to know God, it has to be through his effects. So they both operate off of that, but they do allow us, especially the principle model, to say true things about God himself by virtue of the similarities we observe in his effects and our effects.
Yeah, because it almost seems like the healthy model, it tries to have so much of a creator-creature distinction that it almost doesn't say that God is that thing that he is producing to some extent. Like when you talk about medicine, when we're saying that medicine is healthy by virtue of its effect, that's not saying that the medicine is necessarily inherently healthy. So if you just take that model, you might I guess in applying it to God, you might say, well, God is simply just applying good things in his creation, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's really good in his essence. He's just good by virtue of what he does, but not necessarily who he is. And I think that's where the principle model comes in.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Because the healthy model can only it only says these names in a secondary way about God. It actually says these things primarily of the things that we see in creation. Whereas the principle model will say both of them, like in that primary sense, so to speak.
Sean, you want to add anything else?
Yeah. So you said that there were originally 4 models. Did you find the other 2 models to be good ways of explaining analogy, or not at all?
It just doesn't really apply to God. It's not that they're
Okay.
not useful. It just doesn't apply to God very well. Um, Actually, the first model, which is similar to it, would be more what Jeff Johnson, I guess, would mean by analogy, which is that there's like a real similarity in the things of themselves. But that was never embraced by people who were defending the analogy model. They would always use either the principle model or the healthy model. That was just one of the subcategories Boethius had. And then the other one is ab uno, which actually refers to the things having a common genre. So they're different species of the same genre.
That would be problematic.
That's
when we're
that's
talking about God.
heavily problematic.
That puts
There's
them on
no-
the category of creatures at that
exactly, and that's why no one uses it. That's why no one uses
Right.
that when talking about God. So it's really only the 2 that I mentioned that are even possibilities. If
And
we're gonna try to
specifically
answer
was
the
against
2
that.
problems. Sorry.
Oh, I was just saying, Aquinas was specifically against utilizing genus and species when talking to God in the
Yeah, and they all were. Yeah, even Scotus, I think, would have been against using that. I don't know how Scotus justified his methodology, really, unless he really did think this was only from a logical standpoint and not a
Well, yeah, because
metaphysical.
once you utilize any kind of univocal language, even in a supposed analogy, it's no longer an analogy. It's
exactly.
You're mixing categories at that point.
Yeah, and
All
he
right.
wouldn't say that he believes in an analogy. He was against
right.
it.
Right.
But the issue is you destroy the creator creature distinction that
Yep.
way. I don't know how he would rescue it. I don't know if he even really tries to. Honestly, I haven't read enough Scotus to be able to tell you that.
So it almost seems like Jeff, in that quote that I read, is trying to preserve analogy, because I think he does think that analogical language is right. He just doesn't see God as so different from his creation that we can't speak of him in any meaningful way, I guess.
Yeah, he's just using analogy in a non-traditional way, because
Right.
when Christians have done it in the past, if they've spoken of those 2 categories, the healthy model and the principle model, but he's using one that was never used because it doesn't actually solve the problem that it's trying to by avoiding univocal predication. You might as well just go the route of Scotus and say that, yeah, we're using these things univocally at that point.
Right.
Well, most Christians, I would imagine, even those on the opposite side of the debate, would recognize the validity of analogy in some circumstances, because they do read passages where God is said to have wings, and they recognize, oh no, this is a metaphor. This isn't meant to be taken literally. I think the issue is seeing that everything needs to be thought about in that way, and not just certain passages. I think that's where probably the disconnect comes in.
Yeah, like I think especially when we're talking about the image of God, how man is made in the image of God. Well, we say man is made in the image of God because there are things that appear to be similar in us and God. We believe we have some sort of morality. We have a conscience. We're thinking, understanding human or creatures as opposed to animals. So I think when we look at the image of God, we tend to utilize language that tends to blur those distinctions that we have to keep when we're talking about God's creation and God himself.
Yeah. In fact, I like what you said about us being in the image of God there, because I think thinking about it in this way actually helps us to understand what exactly that means, because I would argue that the reason man is in the image of God is because he's capable of participating in all of those perfections, all of the universals of creation that allows him to model them in a better way than, say, a rock can, because it can't participate in wisdom or and the like. So that, and it also helps us to understand how Christ when he's perfectly playing the part of the image of God, he is in his humanity actualizing those perfections in the most perfect way a man can actualize it. So that's why not only is he God incarnate, but his humanity actually serves to perfectly image God as greatly as anything in creation can be.
We
Because
even
that's what
see
we
that
actually observe
language
directly.
in,
It's just human nature.
yeah. Well, we even see that language used of Christ in the scriptures. He's the image of God, right?
Yeah,
And that's pointing to his deity, but it's also talking about him in his incarnation as well. He is the perfect image of God. He is what the perfect image of God in humanity would look like.
exactly.
Just being so in the incarnation in that case.
Amen.
All right, Sean, anything else to add before we close?
No, I think I'm good.
All
Glad to
right.
be back on.
Yeah, it's good to have you back,
Mhm.
Sean. It's good to have you
Mm.
back. Well, Andrew,
Apparently,
thanks. No, go
I
ahead,
was
Sean.
gonna. I was just gonna say. Apparently, I do remember how to be a podcast host, so that's good.
And then you're gonna forget again, aren't you?
Yep.
Just remember next time you're sharing a PowerPoint. All right.
Well,
Yeah,
Andrew,
thank you,
thanks
brother, so
for
much for having me.
yeah,
It's
yeah.
always
Thanks
good.
for coming on. I really appreciate it. Definitely difficult concepts. So this is definitely probably the most technical episode we've done, but it's good. It's good that we expand our minds and get into these things because we're talking about the creator of the universe. We're talking about God, the most important being that we will ever know, and that we need to make sure that we know as revealed in Scripture. So it's good to dive into these difficult things. But thanks for taking us through these things. And that, everyone, there won't be an episode this Saturday. This is our episode for the week. So Lord willing, we'll be back next Saturday. But with that, everyone, have a great week, and we'll see you again next week.